I would agree with you that right now the relationship between China and the United States does not look good. And Democrats and Republicans don't agree on much, but they do agree on the need to take a tough line when it comes to China. The position that it has taken on Hong Kong, its behavior in Xinjiang towards the Uyghurs. This has not won a lot of friends in the United States, or frankly, for that matter, in other parts of the world. The Chinese, I think, have come off as kind of cynical and opportunistic. But I do think that this relationship is too important to let it slide into, as you put it, zero-sum intense competition. And I don't think it's too late. And I don't think it's too late for several reasons. One is that I don't think it's realistic to imagine a bipolar world similar to that of the Cold War, because the world has become too integrated and interdependent. People talk about a decoupling of the United States and China. I don't see it. I think the US and China and South Korea and Japan and other markets are now so deeply intertwined that kind of pulling apart into competing blocks is very difficult to imagine. Yes, I do see some reallocation of supply lines, particularly in high tech, in things like 5G, but the bigger economic relationship, very difficult to untangle.
I was very comfortable with a cat. I was very uncomfortable with a tiger. And that's a very good analogy, because in 1980, in purchasing power parity terms, China's GNP was 10% of the United States. 10% in purchasing power parity terms. That was the time of Deng Xiaoping. But by 2014, 34 years later, China's GNP had become bigger than the United States in purchasing power parity terms. It's gone up 10 times in 34 years. So the cat has become a tiger. So I think it's unrealistic to expect that when the cat becomes a tiger, you should treat the tiger like a cat. You've got to treat the tiger like a tiger. And that's a reality, right? You have to deal with it. So in international relations, the biggest danger in international relations is engaging in wishful thinking. And I guarantee you this, if Deng Xiaoping was leader of China today, in 2021, he will be as assertive as Xi Jinping, because there is also Chinese public opinion. Now, there's a Harvard Kennedy School academic study, and I'm sure you can trust the Harvard Kennedy School, that shows that support for the Chinese government has gone up in the last 10 years in China, right?
Right.
And why? Because the Chinese government has delivered the greatest improvement in the standard of living of the Chinese people. For the improvement in standard of living of Chinese people, the last 40 years have been the best 40 years in 4,000 years of Chinese history. The Chinese people, especially the people at the bottom, have never experienced such an improvement in the standard of living. So the Chinese people are very happy with their government, and the Chinese people support their government on the various things that the Chinese government is doing. And at the same time, even though China has become more assertive, China has not become aggressive.
I do think that we're unlikely to see a big change in U.S. foreign policy toward China if Mr. Biden wins. And that's because there are underlying conflicts of interest that are very difficult, if not impossible, to escape, over geopolitics, over trade, over human rights, over the status of Hong Kong and Taiwan. These are very difficult problems. But I do think we know that Chinese influence will grow in the years ahead, and that one of the great challenges of our time will be managing the relationship between the United States and China as Chinese influence grows and as Chinese ambition grows. And I do invite South Korea to be a broker, to help serve as a bridge between China and the United States, to help create an environment in which, as China becomes strong, the relationship with the United States does not get worse and worse, but rather finds a way to evolve together, to find some kind of meeting of the minds about what East Asia will look like in a world in which both China and the United States play a prominent role in that region. America's allies, particularly South Korea and Japan, I think have an important role to play in guiding China and the United States toward a peaceful management of this coming power transition.
Well, I have argued that we should have no illusions that China is going to become a liberal society. Xi Jinping has been clamping down with tighter than ever party control. So I don't see China changing very much internally, but I think we can still influence China's external behavior by maintaining our alliances and working in multilateral institutions. So I've described the relationship between the United States and China as a cooperative rivalry. And that has two parts to it. You have to have cooperation and rivalry at the same time. There's some issues, for example, climate change or pandemics, which no country can solve alone. And so if we're going to deal with that, we have to have cooperation with China. And at the same time, there'll be issues which are a rivalry. For example, if China tries to pour sand on rocks and reefs in the South China Sea and call them an island with territorial seas, that's against international law as determined by the Hague Tribunal on the Law of the Sea. And so America will have to be willing to continue to sail its navy through these false claims to show that freedom of the seas and freedom of navigation still attains. But it doesn't mean it has to be a new Cold War. It doesn't mean that everything is good or everything is bad. We're going to have to learn to cooperate with China and also pursue a rivalry with China in places where each is appropriate. So I think a moral leadership for the next decade is going to have to see China in that term, not as an enemy, but as a rival, but also as a rival where in some places we will have to cooperate.
The purpose of diplomacy is to talk to your enemies. Now, so United States has misunderstood what diplomacy is all about. United States wants to establish diplomatic relations only with friends, not with enemies. That's a complete misunderstanding of why diplomacy came about. So, for example, if North Korea is an enemy of the United States, the first thing the United States should do is establish diplomatic relations with North Korea so we can talk to North Korea, right? So the first step, I would say, you cannot wish away North Korea, right? North Korea has now been around since 1953, at least, right? So North Korea is not going to go away. Now, the first principle of realism is that if it is going to be around, you got to talk to them. So number one principle, talk to North Korea, establish diplomatic relations in North Korea. Number two, that if you have to, the biggest strategic decision the United States has to make is that does the United States want to go for regime change or behavior change? As you know, United States policy has been oscillating towards North Korea. Right. Sometimes behavior change, sometimes regime change. So I think it is in South Korea's interest to encourage United States to adopt intelligent, thoughtful, long-term strategic policies towards North Korea. And don't have this crazy situation where President Trump speaks to the North Korean leader, which is a good thing, and then Mike Pompeo and John Bolton insist on the North Korean surrender, which is a bad thing. Right. It doesn't make sense, And so since South Korea has the biggest interest in stabilizing the situation in the Korean Peninsula, South Korea should make an effort to educate Washington, D.C. on how to deal with North Korea. And South Korea should advocate that the United States should establish diplomatic relations with North Korea. Because at the end of the day, I was a diplomat for 33 years, And the best way to persuade people is to talk to people face to face.
I mean, I do think that as the 21st century moves forward, we are going to see a more regionalized world. We are going to see a world in which there are two big peer competitors, China and the United States, but then a host of smaller mid-sized powers like Japan, South Korea, Russia, India, European Union and its member states. And we're going to be in a very effectively in a multipolar world in which on a day-to-day basis, the management of the system is going to be harder than it used to be because there is no longer a clear captain at the helm. Now we're headed into what I called in a previous book, no one's world, in which there will be no clear leader. There will be no capital that calls the shots. It's not going to be China. China is not going to run the world, nor do I think China has an interest in running the world. China is much more mercantilist. It's much more interested in a kind of realist world than it is in a normative world. But I do think that a no one's world is not a world in which we necessarily move toward power vacuums and chaos. It's one in which we have to see that we need a new system of management, new norms, build a working sense of the way forward with the Chinese, with the Russians as stakeholders, preferably not against them.